Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is a presentation of Clean Energy Group's Resilient Power Project, and our topic for this webinar is Energy Storage in PJM, Wholesale Market Rules and Requirements. And we have a guest speaker with us today from PJM Interconnection, and our host for this webinar is Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is a project director here at Clean Energy Group. And before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants today are in listen-only mode. This means that hopefully you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of our webinar. You can use your computer's mic and speakers, or you can call in using your telephone. And there are some instructions on your screen there for that. A very important note, please type your questions in as you think of them by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We have a lot of people on the line today. We expect to have a lot of questions, so type your question in when you think of it, and we will read through all of those. We'll be saving time for a Q&A at the end of our presentation, so again, type your questions in as you think of them. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous Resilient Power Project webinars on our website at resilient-power.org. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd?
Thanks very much, Samantha. Welcome everybody to the webinar. This is, as Samantha said, quite a popular topic, and we're expecting we already have a lot of attendees. So we are going to leave as much room as we can for questions, and so I'm going to do a very brief intro, little background on the Resilient Power Project, and then I will introduce our speaker, Scott Baker from PJM. So the Resilient Power Project is a project of Clean Energy Group. It's supported by a number of foundations, as you can see on the screen. Next slide, please. And basically, this project came about in the wake of Superstorm Sandy. And although we had previously done some work on the idea of resiliency, really it was Sandy that kind of brought this to the fore in the Northeast, and we got contacted by a number of states that were very concerned about resiliency issues and how to make sure that critical facilities were able to self-supply with electricity even when the grid was down in cases of a natural disaster, so that they could provide first responder and medical support to the communities and shelters and so forth. So we've done quite a lot of work over the past couple of years, 3 years really, on this topic. Created a bunch of reports. As you can see, there's a few there on the screen. Those are all freely available for download on our website. We do a lot of these webinars. We work with states. We work with municipalities, work with national labs. And so this webinar is one of a series. There are many others archived, and you can review those on our website. This one will also be archived and available for review, and we'll have some information on upcoming webinars at the end in case you want to sign up for those. Next slide, please. So I want to introduce Scott Baker. He's a Senior Business Solutions Analyst in the Applied Solutions Department at PJM. He leads PJM's Advanced Technology Pilot Program, where he evaluates emerging technology and policy issues in the electric power sector. So he's really perfect for this topic. In this role, he administers technology demonstration projects with PJM members, research institutions, and the industry at large. Recently, this work is focused on market evolution initiatives related to demand response and energy storage technologies participating in the PJM capacity and ancillary services markets. Prior to joining PJM, Scott worked as a researcher and project manager at the University of Delaware's Center for Carbon-Free Power Integration, and he worked on vehicle-to-grid technology, helping to successfully deploy the first electric vehicles to provide ancillary services to the electric system in October of 2007. Scott has a Bachelor of Science degree in Biology and Environmental Science from Ithaca College in New York and a master's degree from the University of Delaware, where he studied the offshore wind power resource in the Atlantic Ocean and the related electric system integration issues. And before I turn this over to Scott, I want to just give a really brief kind of context for this webinar. And Scott, please correct me if I misspeak about any of this. PJM has really come to the fore nationally as the leading ISO or RTO in terms of really putting together market policy and regulations that enable distributed resources to participate in ancillary services markets. And so there's been quite a lot of interest and activity in PJM with storage developers putting distributed storage behind the meter and looking to participate in markets such as frequency regulation. And the frequency regulation market has been quite attractive in part because of the premium offered for fast response resources such as storage. So, in the context of that market, we've seen, for example, in New Jersey, a large number of projects that received grants from the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities to, provide these resources to support resiliency. And all of those projects in the first round of funding were planning to sell frequency regulation. So, and since that time, there's been some changes. The ISO is, as I understand it, doing some reevaluation of the fast response market rules and needs, and at the same time, I believe in some of those cases there was some misunderstanding on the part of project developers as to what storage can and can't do from behind the meter in PJM in terms of selling into these markets. So that said, I'm going to pass this over to Scott for his presentation. As I noted, there are at this point 236 attendees. It's a very large webinar audience, so please enter your comments, type your comments in as questions in as they occur to you, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. Okay, Scott Baker, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Todd, and good afternoon, everyone. Looking forward to discussing this topic with you today. It is quite a big topic and a challenge to fit into just a little less than an hour. So what I'd like to do today is just introduce briefly kind of the two different ways in which energy storage is integrated into PJM wholesale markets, with a focus on the details around distributed energy storage, and in particular behind the meter energy storage, and the ways in which those types of resources can participate through our demand response program. So I'll have a little bit more detail on that specific use case, and then just leave you with some closing thoughts on current happenings or considerations as you may move forward developing these types of resources and think about bringing them into PJM. There's a large audience on the phone, so I wasn't sure who was familiar with PJM, but on this first slide here, I'm just showing you the footprint that we operate. It's 13 states plus the District of Columbia, 61 million people, and we have a historical peak load of 165,000 megawatts. It's quite a large system. It's the second largest grid by peak load in the world, and it's the largest wholesale power market in the world. And as the grid operator, we're responsible for operating the bulk electric power system, which is high voltage transmission and generation, and also running the wholesale power markets that cover that area. And so here I'm showing you a graphic of the different types of markets that PJM runs, and and how those markets kind of proceed chronologically. So we have markets that operate in quote-unquote real time. That's sort of 5-minute dispatch of generation, 5-minute pricing. And then we have day-ahead markets, which are cleared the day ahead. They are hourly pricing signals. And then we have longer-term markets, such as our capacity market, which is a 3-year forward capacity procurement mechanism, and then also financial transmission rights. Okay, so the two different ways in which storage comes into PJM and kind of the way in which we think about it, if you will, is either as generation. So that's grid-connected energy storage. It's directly connecting to either a distribution facility or a transmission facility. And then the other way we think about it is as demand response, which is behind a retail meter. So I'm going to briefly go over energy storage in the generation context, and then I'll get into the energy storage in the demand response context. We have quite a bit of experience with grid-connected energy storage at this point. We have 263 megawatts in operation, another 50-plus megawatts under construction, and a lot more megawatts in the queue. Over 600 megawatts in the queue waiting to be studied, but keep in mind that only a small portion of projects that go into the interconnection queue ultimately come to commercial operation. So PJM, I think, has quite a bit of experience, and as Todd mentioned earlier, PJM has talked about a lot in terms of energy storage, and this is really the context. It's the grid scale transmission or distribution connected storage that is the predominant amount of energy storage that's currently operating on our system. So here I'm showing a picture of the AES project at Laurel Mountain. This next picture is an image of a 32 megawatt facility in West Virginia. And those are that's the largest, from a megawatt capacity standpoint, that's the largest battery system that we have interconnected to date. So just to show you kind of what the interconnection process is, if you want to connect a storage device to the system, you need to submit an application into our planning queue. And I'm just showing you here the different steps of the planning queue. So once applications are received, they go through a feasibility study phase. Once they go through the feasibility study stage, if the project wishes to continue, there's a more detailed analysis called an impact study. The results of that go back to the owner of the queue position. If they wish to continue forward, there's the last and sort of final step is the facility study. And then after the facility study, the project can wish to execute either an interconnection service agreement or a wholesale market participation agreement. And I'll talk about those two in just 1 second. Keep in mind that of all of the megawatts that have ever come into PJM's interconnection queue since it's been in existence, only 11% of the capacity that's been submitted has actually come to commercial operation. So keep that in mind if you go onto the queue and you're looking at storage projects. Just keep in mind that the amount that's in there isn't ultimately the amount that's going to be built. Very briefly, to initiate this process for a project, you are going to submit what we call an attachment. And the attachment varies by the nature of the project. So an attachment N project is a resource that's greater than 2 megawatts. And typically, that resource is also requesting capacity interconnection rights. Attachment Y are for resources that are less than or equal to 2 megawatts. We have an attachment BB, which is for very small inverter-based resources. And then we also have transmission and energy efficiency upgrades. Now, after you go through the study process, there is a service agreement that needs to be executed, and it's either in the form of, in the case of energy storage, it's either in the form of an interconnection service agreement or a wholesale market participation agreement. The difference between those two is primarily over jurisdiction. So a FERC jurisdictional project, which is anything that's connecting to transmission level voltages or a line that has previously had a wholesale project interconnected to it, is going to be considered FERC jurisdictional. If you're connecting to typically a distribution facility, and a distribution facility that has never had a wholesale generator connected to it previously, then you're going to sign a wholesale market participation agreement. The primary difference between those two, other than jurisdiction, is that the WMPA requires an additional two-party interconnection agreement between the developer and the transmission owner. So PJM is, I guess you could say, sort of a little bit less involved in that process. And in terms of storage, you know, all of the Q projects are publicly available. So if you go to pjm.com, and I've created a direct link here to the planning queue. But if you go to pjm.com, you can actually sort through all of the projects that are in the interconnection queue. Top left, you see there, you can sort by fuel type. So we have a storage fuel type, and you can also search by status, whether you want to see projects that are already in service, projects that are under construction, or projects that are just under study. And then you also have the ability to search by state. So here I'm just giving you a snapshot of some in-service projects. So please feel free to go ahead and look at that when it comes to storage. In terms of provisions for energy storage that is directly connecting to the system as a generator would, there's really two sort of important distinctions for energy storage. One, we have a definition here, which is either a flywheel or a battery storage facility that's solely used for short-term storage and injection of energy at a later time to participate in PJM markets. I emphasize the word solely there because this has recently come up as a bit of an issue in the definition. And the issue is, if you have a storage facility that is going through the interconnection process, but is also perhaps able to provide a retail service, either directly behind the meter of a load or some other interconnection to a load, then that's not a resource that's solely providing a wholesale service. And the reason that becomes important is primarily because of this second definition of station power, which is that, sort of paraphrasing that, it means that an energy storage resource that's charging and discharging as a wholesale resource, the energy used to charge that facility is also deemed to be a wholesale transaction. So you're being charged wholesale for energy used to charge the battery, and you're settling at wholesale when you're selling energy back to the grid. For resources that are providing a wholesale service and may also provide a retail service, that complicates the matter. And so we've recently had to go through kind of a fine legal reading of this definition to determine, is the resource actually solely a wholesale resource or not? So that's why I just wanted to bring up those two definitions. Moving on to kind of the second category of how energy storage participates in PJM, and I think what's probably the focus of this webinar is behind-the-meter energy storage. And this is called distributed energy storage. In PJM, we think of this as demand response. we think of anything that's behind a retail meter, whether it's a diesel genset, a water heater, an air conditioner, or a battery. We think of it as demand response, and so that's how it comes into PJM to participate in our markets. Just to show you a little bit about kind of what's out there in the storage space and participating in our markets, I just wanted to give you a glimpse of two different ancillary services that PJM operates. The first one is synchronized reserves, regulation. Regulation is typically the service that most battery storage devices, or any storage device, is participating or is providing rather in PJM. Regulation service, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a kind of second-by-second signal that is sent to resources in order to balance the very short-term differences between generation and load. So as PJM, as the balancing authority, we're responsible for maintaining flows in and out of PJM and also maintaining frequency. And so we use this regulation service to control both of those things. And so we're dispatching resources on a 2-second basis, adjusting their position in order to balance generation and load. So in PJM, we have 22 megawatts of DR that's registered to provide regulation. And then this pie chart is showing you the breakdown of what those resources are. So a little less than half of those megawatts are being provided by thermal storage in the form of water heaters. Almost a little less than a quarter of those resources are being provided currently by battery technology. And then you see the other technologies that are used there. When it comes to another ancillary service, synchronized reserves, you can see we have, if you look at the bottom of that table, we have 575 megawatts total demand response providing this service. But when you look at the breakdown, you can see that we don't have any batteries providing this service. So most of it's being provided by manufacturing load, generators, water heaters, and then a small amount from HVAC and other loads. So to get into the details a little bit about what are the requirements on demand response energy storage for participating in the markets. And a lot of these requirements that I've pulled up here in the next couple of slides are general requirements of DR, but then there's some also that are specific to providing regulation. The reason I did that, it's a little presumptuous, but I think most people would agree that battery storage today is really seeking to provide that regulation service, and so that's why I just wanted to tailor some of the requirements in that particular market. So first, just in terms of general requirements to provide regulation, you have to be able to receive and react to this control signal that's being sent from PJM. You're doing that via telemetry, is how you're receiving the signal, and we use, for DR resources, we're using a encrypted internet protocol. We call it Jetstream. That's how we're communicating with these resources. You must be able to offer at least 100 kilowatts, 0.1 megawatts, into the market. That can either be from a single resource or it can be from an aggregated set of resources. You, of course, need to pass all of the certification requirements and also the testing requirements. So the certification requirements are things like metering, things like training, things like registering each resource. The testing requirements are actually, once the resource is all set up, PJM is going to send it a test signal. you have to prove that you're able to provide the regulation service to a certain satisfactory level. And then I also wanted to make folks aware of the current limitations on the amount of DR that's eligible to clear in these two different ancillary services markets. So currently, there's a limit on PJM procuring a maximum of 25% of the total regulation requirement from demand resources and a total of 33% of the total requirement from DR resources in the synchronized reserve market. I mentioned these are subject to change because these aren't hard and fast requirements, but once we are kind of approaching that limit, PJM goes and sort of evaluates, are there any issues with more DR providing this service? And we've done that with the synchronized reserve market in the past. Okay, this is a fundamental clarification that I really wanted to make sure was clear for participants on this call. The concept of demand response in PJM is load reduction, and only load reduction. It's not load reduction and injections through the retail meter. And that is really fundamental, I think, in some of the earlier New Jersey projects that was misunderstood. And so I just want to make that clear here that PJM does not certify and will not pay demand response that is injecting beyond the meter. So what that means is if you're siting a battery at a facility, you either need to do two things. You need to ensure that the load is larger than the battery resource in such a way that the battery will never be injecting beyond the meter when it's providing a service. Or if there are going to be injections at that facility because maybe there's on-site solar power or other generation, you need to only provide the demand response service during hours in which there won't be injections on the system. So to give you an example of that, if I'm siting a battery and a solar facility behind the meter and I want the battery to participate as a demand response resource, I would only use that battery to participate in the market during hours in which the solar power will not be injecting through the system. And just lastly here, specific to the regulation market, if we do have demand response resources that are frequently injecting, then they're not eligible. They can become eligible if they take actions to prevent future injections, which is sort of what I was saying. You can take actions to only participate during those hours in which you know that there won't be additional injections. When it comes to metering, this is an important topic. For regulation, we're requiring 2-second interval metering, which is matched basically to the regulation signal. For synchronized reserve metering, the requirement is a 1-minute interval. If you're doing energy or capacity with demand response, the metering interval is hourly. The meter has to be certified. Either of these two ANSI standards apply. If the meter you're using is not ANSI certified, there is a procedure for getting that meter approved by PJM, but it's sort of a one-off case. So you have to have the meter tested by a third party to verify its accuracy. It has to be approved by PJM, and basically the end-to-end accuracy has to be plus or minus 2%. When we're talking about inverter-based resources, we're always metering on the AC side of that inverter. And there's more details in Manual 11, which I've provided a link to there. Continuing on metering, the metering is placed at the EDC account level. So that's the electric distribution company. That's basically the main meter of the facility. That's where the meter is placed by default. So submetering is allowed for resources that are providing regulation. This is typically done for storage resources, but it's by exception. So basically, the submetering provision is for loads that are being regulated by such a small, or the facility is much larger than the actual device that's being used to regulate. So you have, I don't know, a 5 megawatt load, and you have a 100 kilowatt or a 10 kilowatt battery behind that load. Because it's so small, it may not be seen at that master meter account level. And so we have this submetering provision that demand response providers can take advantage of. It requires that you submit a one-line diagram to PJM so that we can better understand what other loads are in that facility, and essentially what we're looking for there is just to make sure that there aren't other loads in that facility that aren't being submetered that could be used to offset the regulation that we're getting from the resource that wants to participate. So just to make sure the actual effect to the system is the control that we're seeking. You're not using one load to increase and another load at the same time to decrease, basically. Injections, I think I sort of went over this, but just to be clear here, if there are injections at the site during an hour in which the demand response resource was participating, then the settlement for that hour is sort of nullified. There's no payment. If the resource was paid, there's a settlement adjustment, and then typically PJM and the curtailment service provider will discuss how to prevent injections going forward, just to make sure that that's not continually happening.
Hey, Scott, this is Todd. I just want to jump in for a second to clarify. Sure. Could you define an injection? I'm asking because obviously there's a lot of behind-the-meter solar that's, is integrated into the grid through net metering contracts. So there's net energy metering going on. Is that considered an injection, or if not, what's the definition, and how does that differ from net metering?
Yeah, thanks for jumping in. The way that PJM thinks about injections are essentially instantaneous power. So the way that I think retail agreements are set up is typically over a interval or over a billing cycle, could potentially even be over a year. That's typically how people think about net energy metering. Injections and net energy metering are different. An injection from PJM's point of view is any instantaneous power flow beyond the retail meter, meaning put back through the retail meter onto the grid. Any injection is then not considered demand response. So that is the difference. I think one is more physical. That's the injection. NEM is a little bit more of a policy, if you will.
Okay, so if you're providing, just as an example, if you're providing frequency regulation, regulation up, that's an injection?
No, it should not be an injection, I think is what I'm saying here.
Okay.
I think you're thinking of it's an injection, the battery is releasing power, but in our eyes, it's only offsetting load.
If you provided more frequency up than your total load,
Yes.
that then becomes an injection?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. So the one issue here is that if you're providing a service behind the meter to a facility, but you're also wanting to provide frequency regulation services to the grid, and then you're limited to how much frequency up you can provide depending on how big your load is.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep, that is correct. And I'm glad you brought it up because that is something that really needs to be well understood. So I hope that's clear for folks, but if it isn't, we should discuss it further. I just wanted to end with some practical considerations for folks. There is a lot of, well, I think the New Jersey program and others have been focused on installing solar and storage together. And we've gotten some questions about, well, the battery isn't injecting beyond the meter, it's just the solar facility that's injecting beyond the meter. But again, in PJM's definition of demand response and sort of our FERC-approved tariff, demand response is only a load reduction, and it doesn't matter whether it's coming from a solar PV panel, from a battery, or from any other generator. Any injection will basically not allowed to be counted as demand response. So if there's behind the meter solar PV that's being paired with a battery, just be careful about injections, or at least be careful about your strategy for marketing the resource in one of PJM's markets. Typically these are hourly markets, and they're pretty flexible about when you want to be available and be available to be cleared in the market. So there's ways to get around that. For example, you could participate at night, or participate when the solar PV is not injecting into the system. So just wanted folks to be cautious about that. And then secondly, whenever we're talking about storage and the regulation market, I'm always trying to remind folks that this is a small market. PJM is only procuring 525 megawatts during 5 off-peak hours and 700 megawatts during the other 19 hours, which we call on-peak hours. So it's a pretty small market, and as I mentioned earlier, we have 260 plus megawatts of grid-connected storage today. So many are sort of viewing this regulation market as starting to become saturated with storage. So I'm just always mindful to really remind people of the market dynamics here. And then, I didn't get into this, but the regulation market itself has 2 different signals that resources can follow. There's a traditional signal, which is called Reg A, and there's a more dynamic fast response signal, which is called Reg D. And that Reg D signal is available for, there are additional payments if you're able to follow that signal with good accuracy. And so that is really the signal that storage resources are typically following, and that is the signal that that really we do have a lot of energy storage participating following that signal. There was a current operational issue regarding too much energy storage, or too many resources actually clearing for that fast response product. And so we had to put a kind of a temporary cap on the amount of megawatts that PJM would procure for that fast response service. And so that's currently capped at 40% of the market for most hours, and then there are 6 critical hours in which it's capped at 27% of the market. I won't get into all the operational issues that we're trying to avoid there, but just something else to note, that there is kind of a temporary cap on the total amount of that fast response service that's being procured. So because there's a cap and because there's a lot of storage that's competing to provide that service, really it's become very competitive, and only the very high performers are clearing in this market. And what I mean by performers is when you provide this regulation service, PJM is calculating how well you follow the regulation signal for every single resource, for every single hour. And that calculation goes into your ability to clear for the market. And PJM we're using those performance scores to clear resources, and we've gotten to the point where really only those very high performing resources, you're scoring something between 90 and 95%, are clearing for that fast response service. So again, just another practical consideration if you are interested in the regulation market. And then lastly, this market, like all markets, evolves. And two things that I wanted to mention. The first is that there was a recent problem statement in the PJM stakeholder process that was highlighting some of the barriers to entry for distributed energy resources, particularly resources that are behind the meter but may inject into the system. And so this was approved last month, and there will be a stakeholder process to discuss that particular issue, really the issue that I've spent a lot of time describing here. And so if folks are interested, I've provided a link here, and you can keep up with that resource or keep up with that issue in the PJM stakeholder process. And then lastly, I mentioned the temporary cap on that fast response regulation service, but PJM and its stakeholders are evaluating longer-term changes to the regulation market, and there's a task force that is set up to discuss those changes. So I've provided a link here, and if anybody is interested in following what's happening with the regulation market and what the future changes might look like, I would encourage you to participate in those meetings. They're free and open to the public. And so with that, I've just provided a few other additional resources. There's a very detailed training for demand-side resources participating in the ancillary services market that's available on our website. And so if you'd like to learn more about more of the details as to how you actually get a demand response resource certified in PJM to provide this service, that training will be very helpful. And then lastly, if you're interested in kind of reading the business rules around metering, around dispatch, around registering resources, those are all available in PJM's Manual 11, which is linked there. And then lastly, my email address, please feel free to contact me if you have any questions that weren't answered on this webinar that you think of after the fact. I'd be happy to answer them. So with that, Todd, I will turn it over to you and answer any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Scott. That was very illuminating, and we do have a lot of questions. We'll get to as many as we can. We may extend this webinar a few minutes past the hour if we find that we need to squeeze in a few extra questions. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in with some of the questions from listeners here. One person that says wants a little more clarification on the issue of net metering and injections. You said something to the effect that net metering is over a billing cycle, and this person says net metering is financial, but it's a financial balancing of physical injections.
Yes.
Metered injections are credited against consumption on a monthly basis. So how is that? Why is that different from injections? I think that the gist of the question is, yes, it's a billing cycle issue on the financial side, but on the energy side, it actually is injecting
yes,
power.
Absolutely it is. I just meant the term net energy metering is it's a policy term. It's not a physical term. If I'm putting power back through a meter, I think most people would call that an injection. So that's the term that I'm using to describe the injection. But the policy of both injection and consumption and netting those together is the term net energy metering. The way that PJM thinks about it again is just any physical power flow back through that retail meter is considered an injection. And that's all that we're looking for. It's got nothing to do with energy settlements. It's got nothing to do with billing. It's just got everything to do with the physical act of putting power back through that retail meter.
Okay.
Just to be perfectly clear, net energy metering doesn't have any impact on demand response participation in PJM, meaning we don't even look at whether the site has a net energy metering agreement. That's all a retail energy transaction and not something that we involve ourselves in.
Okay. Well, here's a related question. This person says, is the demand response treatment of storage, I guess they're talking about behind the meter storage, out of convenience? In other words, is it just where the PJM stakeholder process, placed storage? Sounds like storage is limited by PJM's demand response rules, thus limiting the full value to be achieved. Since storage isn't a generator nor a load, DR classification seems incorrect. But this isn't just about storage, right? This is anything that's behind the meter, is that right?
Well, I would partially agree with the question. I mean, it's a little bit out of convenience. I mean, it's the mechanism by which we currently integrate anything that's behind the meter. So we don't set up a separate program, if you will, for battery storage, for diesel generators, for air conditioning. It's all considered demand response. And so to a certain extent, I agree, that's where any storage device that sits behind the meter falls in. It falls into this demand response program. Now, the problem statement that I mentioned is geared towards reevaluating that and to look at resources that whether it's battery storage, whether it's a microgrid facility or any other generator that may be offsetting load but also has the ability to inject into the system. It's to evaluate how we treat those resources going forward.
Okay. Here's somebody who wants to know why the storage capacity is being capped at certain hours. Is it because they collapse the regulation market prices since their marginal prices are low?
No, it's because that fast response regulation signal that most storage devices are following today has an energy neutrality component to it. And so the signal itself is meant to be energy neutral, meaning it's dispatching resources up and down or charging and discharging in the case of a battery in equal amounts over about 15 minutes. And so because it has an energy neutrality component to it, it's caused our operators some problems when you have a lot of megawatts following an energy neutral signal, but the control signal to balance the system needs to stay in a particular direction for a longer period of time. And what happens is, let's say the regulation signal has to stay in the reg up position for a longer period of time. The reg D resources start to go back towards an energy neutrality position, so they start to move back towards their 0 point, when in actuality the operators want them to be moving in a different direction. And so that was the operational constraint that we came up against, and that was the reason for the temporary cap on that service.
Okay. This is a question. I have heard varying opinions on this from developers. Is it possible to put a battery behind a separate meter, provide services to the load behind the meter, but then also provides grid services as a resource that's not limited by the size of the load?
I think I understand the question, and the answer is yes, it's possible to do that, but the one sort of constraint or limitation that we've come up against is if the resource is set up to do that, then it's not considered to be solely used for wholesale purposes, and that's caused an issue with the wholesale treatment of charging. So just to elaborate a little bit more, the case there is if a storage device is, let's say, providing regulation to PJM, it's charging and discharging, those energy transactions are wholesale. If a resource is providing regulation in 1 hour, charging and discharging, in another hour it's charging and then later providing, say, peak shaving to a commercial facility to reduce its demand charge, say. That's a retail service. If it was using wholesale energy to provide that retail transaction, then there are kind of a host of legal issues around doing that. It's basically like a sale for resale. So that's the legal limitation that we've come up with for that particular situation.
Okay, one follow-up to that, and then I'm going to move on to other topics. So obviously there's a lot of interest in batteries for provision of resilient power, which is a service that is only provided when the grid is down by definition. So in that case, if you have a storage resource and you want to provide frequency regulation and you want to provide a resilient power service to the load, but by definition would only provide that when the grid is down, are you still going to run into this issue of essentially a legal issue with a sale for resale?
Yeah, this to me is the one issue that we do need to really clarify in PJM's tariff and sort of clarify with FERC, or look to clarify with FERC, because under today's sort of reading of our tariff, yes, that is considered a retail. That would be considered a retail service, and the resource wouldn't be considered solely a wholesale service. But I think if you got stakeholders together and discussed that topic, you may come out with a different outcome. I agree it's something that needs to be addressed, though, because that is clearly a driver of energy storage installation. And again, it's a very unique circumstance where the electric system is down.
Okay, thank you. Somebody wants to know, why aren't batteries providing synchronized reserves services, PJM?
Well, this is just an opinion. It's really because the regulation market is higher value, and it's better suited to shorter energy duration currently. So, as you know, with energy storage, you have to buy all of the kilowatt hours of that device up front, so there's a capital cost associated with it, and any service that requires more kilowatt hours is going to be more costly. So for synchronized reserves, you may have to build a battery that has a longer duration, so typically that's going to cost more, and then on top of that, the service is less valuable. So you put those two pieces together, and it doesn't exactly make sense today.
Okay, great.
At least right now. I mean, I think we'll see. We'll see what happens in a few years.
Sure. Similar question on capacity. Do any in-service storage facilities connected to renewable energy generators allow those generators to meet the new PJM capacity performance product requirements?
Can you read that one more time, Todd?
Sure. The question is, do any in-service storage facilities connected to renewable energy generators allow those generators to meet the new PJM capacity performance product requirements? And maybe you can explain what those are as you go.
Got it. Good question. I think the short answer to that is no, because those batteries that are connected to existing renewable energy facilities typically have a small duration discharge at their rated capacity. So I think the quick answer to that is no. The explanation of what it means to be a capacity resource in PJM is that you need to be available to provide energy or ancillary services, depending on how you're dispatched, during PJM system emergencies. And so if you look at the history of PJM system emergencies, they vary in duration, but typically it's on the order, can be on the order of hours. And so a storage resource that wants to participate as capacity typically has to have a much longer duration than what's being installed today, which is, sub-hourly duration batteries.
Okay, great. So another issue where that may change as we see things like flow batteries begin to enter the market.
Yes,
and extend some of those discharge times.
I agree.
Okay, here's another really good question from one of the participants. Can you describe the recent system operation issues that PJM has encountered as a result of the Reg D market rules, which were created to incent grid-scale storage to provide fast frequency service?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think I went over it a little bit earlier, but it's basically it has to do with the energy neutrality component of that fast response regulation signal. And at times in which you want all of the regulation resources to be moving in a single direction for an extended period of time, the way that fast response energy neutrality signal is engineered, those resources will sort of stop moving in that direction and will start moving in the opposite direction. And so that's exactly what we don't want from resources that are, providing a balancing service. We want them moving in the same direction as the control signal. And so that's fundamentally, that's the issue. And so in that stakeholder group that I mentioned and provided a link to in the presentation, you can learn a whole lot more about that topic. They're discussing it at every meeting. And you can also learn about what the potential outcomes are for the energy neutrality component of that fast response regulation signal. There's a lot of discussion about should that energy neutrality component change somehow.
Can you give us a sense of what the time frame is on these stakeholder discussions and when PJM may, move to make any changes?
Yep, very good question. I believe they are typically monthly. I'm trying to check on the fly, but they're typically monthly or perhaps maybe 3 times every 2 months. They meet. All of the materials from previous meetings are posted online, so you can go onto that task force webpage and understand kind of what's been presented to date. There's been a lot of presentations from PJM staff, from other stakeholders that have identified this issue. And Todd, it looks like they're meeting about once a month. In terms of time frame for resolution, I would say PJM is definitely shooting for this issue to be resolved by the end of this year. And there's a lot of issues to discuss. It's more than just this energy neutrality component of the fast response signal. So it's nothing that's going to be resolved very quickly, but at the same time, this hard cap on Reg D was sort of meant to be a short-term fix, so we don't want that to persist for a very long time. So hopefully it's resolved by the end of this year.
Okay, great. We're at an hour, but I understand that you're available to stay for a few more minutes. Is that right?
Sure, a few more minutes. Yep.
Okay, because we have a lot of we still have quite a number of questions. We're not going to get to all of them, but there's a few that I'd like to try to get to. Okay. So we'll extend this by a few minutes. There's a couple of questions about the queue. One is, what are the major reasons for turning down 89% of non-approved projects? And the other is, how does the percentage of storage projects that make it through the application study phases, 11%, compared to traditional generation?
Oh, good question. The first question about turning down 89% of capacity, that's not a decision that PJM makes. It's a decision that typically the developer is making. Usually the decision is based on the cost to interconnect, but certainly it can be based on a whole host of other factors, not the least of which is securing a site, financing the project, et cetera, market conditions, fuel prices. So there's a whole host of issues as to why somebody might have a project studied, but then ultimately never bring it into the market. But PJM will never say the project cannot be built. PJM and the transmission owner are just responsible for identifying issues with interconnection and the cost associated with fixing those issues at that particular location. So it's not uncommon for developers to put in multiple queue positions knowing that they may only develop one of those that is the best fit. And then the second piece was about storage in the queue. The 11% number there was a fuel neutral number. So if you look at it by fuel type, I'm sure that number differs a little bit, and I don't know what the number is currently for storage. I don't currently know what percentage of storage that has come through the queue has ultimately come to fruition. It's probably a bit higher than 11% though.
Okay. What metering or control regime is required to ensure that batteries interconnected as demand response do not inject during the same hour as they participate in frequency regulation?
That's a good question. The metering portion would be a 2-second interval meter at the EDC account level, so at the electric distribution company meter level of the facility, and the telemetry from that meter would be used to monitor injections. In terms of control, I think the question was about control strategies to prevent injections. I'm not sure that we have a specific control strategy in mind. That's something that would be kind of a case-by-case basis that we would work with the demand response provider to identify.
Okay. This is a question about the Supreme Court decision on FERC jurisdiction of demand response. Okay. The question is, how did that decision affect demand response in PJM, and what would have changed under a different decision, if anything?
Well, that decision meant that PJM can essentially operate as we've been operating, by clearing demand response in our markets and paying it for the services that it provides. At the most fundamental level, that's what that decision means. Had the decision gone the other way, we would have waited for FERC guidance on what to do, but it potentially could have meant rerunning markets, resettling transactions, and a whole host of other things that would keep us very, very busy. So I think that's fundamentally that's what the decision meant. It's sort of business as usual regarding demand response in PJM and other ISO RTO markets.
Okay. And I think this is going to have to be our last question because we have pushed it a little bit. The question is on the overall market size and opportunities for new projects. The question is that regulation market is 525 megawatts off-peak and 700 megawatts on-peak. It's currently 263 megawatts of connected projects. Therefore, is it safe to say that there is 437 megawatts of available space? And if so, how much is already in the queue? This is a questioner who's trying to evaluate the potential space for new projects. And I think I'm probably safe in saying it's not exactly a space issue, but a competition issue. But I'm going to
it's a competition issue, and to be honest with you, there is it's a little bit more complicated than just looking at the raw megawatt number. To further explain that just briefly, for fast response resources, we adjust the megawatts that they offer by something called a benefits factor. And a benefits factor is a sliding scale integer that we apply in order to adjust those megawatts based on the additional value that they have providing regulation service. To give you an example, if a 1 megawatt battery bid into the market and it was assigned a benefits factor of 2, we would clear that resource as 2 megawatts. And it's a pretty complicated topic, so I don't want to get into it too much here because I'll just confuse people further. But looking at just the raw megawatt amount, the 525 and the 700 amount, and the raw megawatt amount that is built today is not the most accurate way to assess kind of what quote-unquote space is left for additional storage projects. If the person who asked that question would like to know more detail for further describe that issue, please just send me an email at scott.baker@pjm.com. I'd be happy to tell you more about it.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. This has been really, really informative and helpful, and I think, judging by the attendance, it's of great interest. And I think folks should, as Scott said, feel free to contact him or us or look at the business manuals that are posted at PJM's website. We have a couple of on-screen links here, but you can simply go to the website and find those manuals. Samantha, I think we have a number of other webinars coming up in very short order, including one on Thursday, and some the following weeks that we want to let people know about.
We do, yes. We've got quite a few webinars coming up, including one Thursday, as you said. And all of these webinars are free and open to the public. There's a list of some of the upcoming webinars on your screen. And to register and for more details, our web address is resilient-power.org. And to end with, I just want to put up some of our contact details on the screen, including our web address, again, resilient-power.org. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today for this webinar.
Yep, thanks very much. And do check out the archived recording of this webinar if you would like, and the slides, which will be posted shortly. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.